Now that you've formed your company and you have your idea, the ball's rolling, you might need a space to work from. I know many of you are probably working from home, but people think that now is actually the worst time to find a commercial space, but it actually might be the best time because the prices are low and landlords want to fill the spaces. So now would be an ultimate time to negotiate the terms of your lease as well as the rents that would be due. So for those who are entering into a new commercial lease, whether it's an office space or retail space, you should be aware of what you're getting yourself into and educate yourself with the terms of the lease and what possibilities you have if this persists or if your business fails. And if, God forbid, we have another situation like COVID that would affect your business and your commercial lease. So the first thing that I want all the tenants to be aware of is can you afford your rent? Be realistic, go through your business plan. This is something that you should take into consideration. Yes, now is a time to negotiate with your landlord, but usually commercial leases are signed for a term that is between 5 to 20 or even 30 years. So you do want to think of the future and be sure that you'll be able to pay the rent so that you're not in default now and in the future. Another thing to be aware of is your personal guarantee and any sort of timelines with that. We'll get to that later on. And the next thing that I've been telling my clients to be aware of is introducing what we call a force majeure clause into your lease. This is not a standard clause that is found in leases. And it is basically something that protects all parties involved in the event of a catastrophe or what we call an act of God. Usually these are natural disasters, a hurricane, a fire, but recently we've been seeing that both landlords and tenants have been including pandemics, epidemics, and government shutdowns as part of the force majeure clause. A few things to note regarding this clause: it basically forgives both parties from their responsibilities during this act of God. So let's say you had this clause in your lease, it included language that pertains to COVID and the government shutdown. The landlord would not have to be responsible for certain things during this time, and the tenant would not have to be responsible for their responsibilities under the lease, and that neither party would be in default if they do not act. The one thing to be aware of is that usually these clauses do not include non-payment of rent. So this is a huge thing. Obviously businesses are financially in a difficult position today, as they have been for the last 7 months, and we're not really sure how long this is going to proceed. So, force majeure cannot protect you in that sense, but tenants should also be aware of any other clauses in their lease, such as the guarantee, that would potentially allow them to get out of their lease with a minimal payment due or a minimal default. Also, the force majeure clause is defined very specifically by judges in the event that you do end up in court. And like I said, it does not include anything that would entail COVID, although COVID seems like a natural disaster. In fact, the consequences to that are actually the government shutdown and the inability for people to be working or conduct business, which is not usually included in our definition of the act of God. And that is exactly why we've been recommending this inclusion in new leases. Some tenants might have this in their current leases, but again, COVID is probably not covered under that clause. The next thing we're going to talk about is tenants who are currently in a lease and are having difficulty making payments for rent, haven't been open for business, and are trying to figure out, what they can do during this time so that they can either get out of their lease or they can maintain their lease without being in default, so that eventually when they could open, they have something to work with. So we've been seeing a lot of more communication between the landlords and the tenants during this time. That's important because unfortunately everyone's losing during COVID. Tenants can't conduct business, they're not making money. Landlords still have to pay their mortgage, they still have to pay, if utilities are being used, and various other fees related to owning the premises. And so their landlords and tenants are trying to work together to reach a mutual consensus that will work for both parties. No one wants an empty space, and tenants want some sort of security because you don't know what's going to happen in the future. A few things that we've been seeing regarding current leases is either a decrease in the rent, which is incredibly amazing, and I usually only see with smaller tenants like mom and pop shops where the landlord might only own a few small spaces. They're more willing to work with their tenants, maybe because they have no other options or because they only have a few tenants to work with. This would mean that you agree to amend your current lease and say that instead of your rent being $10,000 for the remainder of the term or for the next year or so, you're going to reduce the rent to $6,000, $7,000, whatever is agreed upon between the landlord and the tenant. That's ideal. The second thing that we're seeing is either a reduction in the rent, but also an income-based payment to the landlord. And what that means is the landlord would take a portion of the tenant's income as a part of the rent. So even if the landlord agrees to reduce your rent by that $5,000 or so, they will take, let's say, 10%, 20% of whatever income that's coming into the business. That way, if the tenant is having a good month in a particular time period, then the landlord at least gets payment for any loss that they've incurred in the past. We've also been seeing tenants who are signing shorter leases. Usually, as I mentioned, usually leases vary between 5 to 30 years. That's because it gives each of the parties stability. A landlord wants to know that this tenant is going to remain in the premises. They'll be able to pay their rent. They want to be in this space. And a tenant knows that they don't have to move. They don't have to pay any sort of fees again, to go elsewhere. Recently, because of the instability of what's going on, tenants have been more willing to sign shorter leases, and landlords have actually been more willing to grant them. If the landlord sees that a tenant is interested in signing a lease, period, they're willing to sign a lease that's even for a year and then renegotiate after the end of the term. That's really important because it keeps the communication open between the landlord and the tenant, and it shows good faith on both parties because they want to remain in relationship with each other and maintain their lease. The last thing that we're seeing is a deferment of the rent. What this would mean is that a landlord would agree to a period of time where the tenant defers payment. So let's say from now until January 1st, the tenant does not have to pay rent, whatever that current rent is, but they would agree that in 6 months from now or 1 year from now, those few months, so it would be October, November, December, the 3 months would then be distributed in the repayment period. So for example, I'm a tenant, my lease is for another 2 years. I haven't paid rent, but my landlord is agreeing to do a deferment plan where I don't pay rent for the next 3 months until January, and then the repayment period would be June of 2021 until January of 2022. So I would have those 6 or 7 months to repay the 3 months that I'm deferring and any past payments due. That's really important because it gives the tenant a little bit of leeway to get back on their feet, remain in the premises, and still be able to make the payments later. Something that I've personally been trying to include in these amendments to the lease, especially for deferment plans, is the right to renegotiate the deferment. And that's important because we just don't know how long this is going to persist. And even if COVID does end and we could see each other in person, no one knows how long the effects on businesses are going to last. So, we know restaurants have been hit really hard. We don't know when the restaurants are going to be able to afford their regular rent for that repayment period, and then also pay the additional deferred payment of rent during the repayment period. So I try to see if landlords are willing to, at the time of the repayment period, renegotiate if necessary.
So just to jump in here, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, Natalie. As Natalie was speaking about this topic, I literally just fielded an email from a not-for-profit that dried up once COVID hit us, and they've just started discussing with the landlord about not being able to pay rent. They haven't paid since March, and how they're going to need to figure out a plan for what to do. And they've asked me to reach out to the landlord and try to negotiate a surrender for them, where at least they won't be chased by the outstanding debt once they vacate the premises. So I don't know if you wanted to just touch on that a little bit too.
Yeah, so a surrender agreement would be in the event that the landlord allows you to just leave the premises, and you would agree to a certain amount due to the landlord, whether it's the entire rent that was due or something just to put the landlord back in a safe position. The tenant would have to remove everything from the premises the way that it would be under their lease, whether you're required to take only your personal belongings, or also bring the premises back to the way that it was prior to the lease. This is something that could be negotiated. I have a tenant now who doesn't want to surrender, but it looks like might have to, because they're just not reaching an agreement with the landlord regarding a repayment period or deferment period. The other thing to consider is a guarantee. Usually tenants sign a personal guarantee on their lease. And although, the tenant would still be liable under the lease, sometimes a landlord will allow the tenant to practice their rights under the guarantee, make certain payments under the guarantee, and also surrender their rights to the premises. A few things that have been enact during this time by New York City, the governor, have also been helping tenants who are in distress. The first thing is that personal guarantees have been suspended from March until today is actually the last day, unless it gets extended again. And what that means is a personal guarantee is generally made by the individual who is the tenant or owns the business that the tenant, that the lease is under. And the personal guarantor would be liable for any payments that were not made by the tenant or whatever the guarantee says. So for instance, a personal guarantee would usually say that if the tenant wants to surrender the lease, they would have to notify the landlord at a minimum of 90 days prior to their surrender date. So that means that you would have to notify your landlord, continue to pay those extra 3 months of rent, and then surrender at the surrender date would be 3 months, which would be 3 months out. So you're still liable for the rent, but it's a shorter period than being responsible for the entire term of your rent and the entire term of your lease, which could be another 10 years from now. So what we've seen is that this personal guarantee has been suspended from the time that COVID began. And what that means is that if a tenant does default during March of 2020 to September 2020, then the landlord cannot demand this guarantee from the individual, as they usually would be. Another thing is that there is a suspension of evictions during this time as well. We've actually just seen an extension of this until January 1st of 2021. So just for your information, that's both for commercial and residential leases. So, the government has obviously seen that tenants are in distress, and they're trying to help New Yorkers in general by protecting them against any sort of liability that they would otherwise be under.